Okay, welcome everybody for coming on behalf of the School of Performance and Cultural Industries to the inaugural lecture by Professor Aylwyn Walsh. I'm going to just speak for a couple of minutes just to kind of mark this celebration before handing over to Paul Outledge, who's going to more formally introduce Ali. I should say who I am, for those who don't know me. I'm Aylwyn Walsh. I'm Professor of Cultural Policy and Participation here in the school. I'm also, more relevantly for today, the Director of Research and Innovation, which is why I've been asked to welcome you all today. But probably more significantly for me, I'm also Ali's roommate. We actually joined BCI at exactly the same time, I think to the day, in 2016. We were put in a shared office together from day one. You could say we spent the first 6 months not really having a clue what we were doing, but I guess we like to see it more that we took a creative approach to what we were doing. And I really loved working with Ali over the last 7 years. And when we both took on leadership roles in the school 2 years ago and were given the opportunity to move into set the rooms, I said without hesitation that I wanted to stay with Ali. I don't know whether she hesitated or not, but we are still sharing the room. So what can I say about Ali? I mean, I'm in awe of the energy and commitment she puts into her work. At times, it's really exhausting, but it's always really inspiring. And I think she inspires as a friend and as a mentor to many of us across the School of Performance and Cultural Industries and beyond that. She's an academic who's absolutely worthy of this promotion to professorship, but she's also an activist, and that plays a really important role in everything she does. She never just accepts that that's the way things are done. She's always asking questions how we can do things better. And in my opinion, that's how change happens, through constantly questioning the status quo. And she plays a really key role in that in the city and beyond. Her research looks at issues around mental health, environmentalism, criminology, a range of topics related to social change. And as I've kind of already emphasised, she not only researches those areas, but she intervenes to bring about change. And crucially in her work, she's not only interested in giving voice to people, but in recognising people already have a voice, but her role is to help them be listened to. And that, for me, is really crucial in the work she does. I think anyone who's worked with Ali will know she cares deeply about everything she does, whether that's in her current leadership role as Director of Postgraduate Research Studies, really integrating the postgraduate research community into the broader research culture of the school and the university, and really bringing postgrads and staff together in a number of different ways, whether it's organising extracurricular activities for the undergraduate master students to build their professional development alongside their academic development, whether it's fighting for social change in her research and activism, and that's included work in Leeds, closer to home, but also in Mexico, and crucially in her home country of South Africa. Through her union work, she, until recently, was one of the union reps for the school. Through her involvement in the ethics committee, I could go on and on listing the many things that Ali has done in the school and for the school. But I'm just going to finish and pass on to Paul by saying I'm really delighted to be here, really delighted to see all of you here. I'm really excited, looking forward to hearing Ali's presentation and for joining everybody for a drink outside afterwards. In Ali's case, it will only be an orange juice, but the rest of us can have something stronger. So congratulations, Ali, and Paul, over to you.
Hi everybody, it's a fantastic turnout, and I think a testament to the esteem in which Ali's held, that folk have shown up on such a really horrible day today. in terms of the weather. I'm delighted to be asked to introduce Aylwyn's inaugural lecture in her promotion to Professor of Performance and Social Change. I first met Aylwyn in Cafe Headingley following our mutual non-appearance on a panel on scholar activism at the university that had been cancelled due to strike action, one of the many strikes the UCU was involved in over the last few years. Aylwyn had reached out suggesting that we meet up, and over coffee we discovered our mutual interest in social justice, in theatre of the oppressed, and politically engaged academic work. Indeed, Aylwyn has made an outstanding contribution to practice-based research. The work has been concerned with participatory arts and performance and their intersections with social change, examining, amongst other things, youth activism, women in prison, arts in healthcare, and street art. Her 2019 monograph, Prison Cultures, Performance, Resistance, Desire, eloquently showed how performance can act as a mode of inquiry into and a tool of resistance within carceral spaces. An earlier 2014 co-edited collection with Murnato Simil-Hugidi called Remapping Crisis, A Guide to Athens, I saw advertised in a little piece outside actually, examined social movements' creative responses to economic and political crisis within the city. And Aylwyn's central abiding concerns with social justice, activism and arts-based political education has found expression in a range of contexts. I'll mention just a couple. Two South African participatory youth-led projects funded by the AHRC and GCRF project Changing the Story. The first generated Youth Activism Toolkit and a Resource School Library in Cape Town, while the second generated over 40 youth-created films on environmental activism in Karoo, South Africa. As part of the Performing Change project, working in collaboration with Walter at Leeds, Aylwyn's used forum theatre workshops to activate change in environmental governance in Mexico. And unsurprisingly, for any great academic, Aylwyn's commitment to social justice, scholar activism and so on have also informed her teaching on applied theatre, socially engaged performance in community contexts, and MA modules in prisons, punishment and performance. Now, in addition to these scholarly activities, Aylwyn's artistic work has been hosted across Europe, including in Germany, Greece, Finland, as well as in Mexico, the US, Brazil, Zambia, and South Africa. She has staged international performances at South Africa's National Arts Festival, at the Berlin Biennale, as well as the 2021 Deviant Women exhibition and installation with Fenia Kotsupulo at the Festival of Queer and Feminist Culture in Croatia. She's directed work at Contact Theatre in Manchester, at the National Theatre in London, at the Love Arts Festival in Leeds, and is also the artistic director of the Ministry of Untold Stories. Wow, it's quite a litany of amazing interventions into academic and public life. I've been fortunate enough to collaborate with Aylwyn on several projects, including the aforementioned research project on youth pedagogy and the arts in Cape Town, South Africa, that also generated with our co-author Alex Sutherland an arts activism toolkit, as well as several research articles, as well as a Sadler seminar series on activist tactics. Beyond the academy, we have both worked on the board of Leeds Tidal, supporting social environmental activism in Leeds, and co-facilitated what we term disobedient theatre workshops with grassroots activists on climate justice and arts activism in Leeds. During the many UCU strikes that I alluded to over the last few years, some of you may have been lucky enough to see us together during the UCU rallies at Parkinson Steps, performing as sweaty assets that reimagine work discipline as punk aerobics, once seen, never forgotten. I've always found Ali to be an inspiring, generous and creative collaborator. She is, for me, an exemplar of the practice and importance of arts-based scholar activism, which is absolutely critical in these times of increasing authoritarianism, climate breakdown, war, inequality and poverty. And so it really warms my heart that in such dark times, Ali's scholarly excellence, underpinned by her intense political commitment within and without the university, is rewarded with an academic chair. And so it is with immense pleasure that I'm now going to introduce Professor Aylwyn Walsh to speak to us about arts and injustice, performing harm and repair.
My goodness, I don't think I've had such nice things said about me for a very long time. That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Pablo, and to Leila for introducing the afternoon. Thanks everyone for being here. So I'm going to kick off with a little bit of reading, and after that I'll stop reading. But this is just the thanks and the opening section, storying how I came into this trajectory of study. I started working in prisons when I was 22 as an artist in residence. My first arts job after graduation was working in maximum security units in Johannesburg's East Round, a landscape characterized by mine dumps where getting to work required long trips in and out to Modderby prison, incarcerating 4,200 men in a space designed for 2,200. It was always a terrible reminder that apartheid criminalized and funneled young black men into prison, and post-apartheid conditions enforced a pipeline scenario, from impoverishment and poor schooling to joblessness and proximity to violent dispossession. I hope it's not all going to be this serious, so I'm moving now into as a newly minted drama graduate. My first arts job was running a festival of community performance with Sibiqua Community Theatre Project. In that role, I was called by the artistic directors. Somehow they were on the phone at the same time, the formidable Phyllis Klotz and Small Ndaba, saying a community group wanted to join the project, but by the way, would I be willing to work in a prison to make this happen? And that invitation soon became a fundamental part of how I saw myself as an arts practitioner committed to social justice. And I found myself left to play in the high security prison, Modderby, doing yoga stretches and bringing in contraband biscuits, don't tell anyone, to the group of men that quickly became a favorite amongst the troops that I was working with. Our work together was creating a performance about sustainable development. And together we were learning about the issues while developing the artistic material for a play competition, which they won, released for the day to perform alongside the other groups. And this would never happen in the UK, so it's quite a moment. I have plenty of stories from that time, but why I'm starting with that today is Modderby Prison and the context of South Africa required that I reflect on my own whiteness as a contributing frame for my experience of the violent institution. It structured the process of engaging with the group, informing our playmaking, and inflecting the experiences of racial injustice that are always present and implicit in South Africa. In the prison frame, however, it is explicit. And since then, I have aimed to make explicit my own embodied privilege as a white artist facilitator and now scholar activist. Shortly after I came to the UK, I was working regularly in 3 and altogether more than 15 prisons up and down the country, using film, performance, and creative writing to start dialogues. Most of the time, sessions were challenging, sometimes stimulating, and often funny. For several years, that was my practice, my workplace, and my interest. And like many other workers in the arts, I had trouble separating out work and not work. After spending half the week planning and attempting to run sessions in prison education or the library, I would travel long hours to get home just to read more about prisons, criminalization, offending, and creative ways to challenge the violence in and of the institution. I would come up with what I had to record as meaningful activity and justify why it could help support reducing reoffending agendas. I even joined the prison band. Along the way, I experienced harassment from the education manager. I spent hours locked in the toilets because I was forgotten there. I rescued musical instruments after a riot had led to a fire on B Wing. I made allegiances with the librarians, and I compiled a zine on prison food with men otherwise locked up for 22 hours a day. After 10 years and a lot of other jobs, I did my PhD with PCI graduate Patrick Duggan, arguing that in part, theatre often produces prison as the end of a story and a closure, whereas what I'd learned from those years in prison classrooms, multi-faith rooms, and libraries was that incarceration is not the end of the story, only a dissatisfying present that is often heavy with violence, dispossession, and loss. But that if people are formulated as lost or not worthy of having life stories that move beyond the ends of prison, that is where harm continues well beyond a prison sentence. Before I move towards the theories of arts activism and the role of the arts in contemporary South African struggles, I want to acknowledge the support and love of my family that got me here. But one of those memories from Modabi times is of my late grandmother, who had given me a lift to work and who was invited in to the prison to share a celebratory meal with those playmakers that had won the play competition. And also to my parents, who weren't able to be here today, but who have never yet questioned my sometimes alarming choices. To work in prisons in the first place, to move abroad, and to pursue with curiosity and a sense of social justice in arts processes. They've always been consistent and fierce in their support. In the first instance, never having to justify why I would do a degree in drama and English when I'd likely never get work in South Africa, a concern that may be live to us now in HE, in arts and humanities in the UK, after a decimation of such subjects. Much love and respect to them. I've since worked with many groups, some new to the arts and some wanting support with arts activism. And my approach has benefited from them, their creativity, and what we've learned together. And I can see Stephen's joined me here today, so thank you very much for being here. So these early experiences of doing social justice work while doing arts work forged my interest, curiosity, and passions. It's messy and complex work, and it's always coalitional and collaborative. To that end, I'd like to thank my colleagues and comrades whose approaches to freedom, activism, and anti-racism have been fundamental to this trajectory. Thanks also to friends, colleagues, and the many artist community groups and courageous folks who decide to give participation a go. So I've already messed up the slides, and now I was meant to bring up the cover of my book. The state enacts its punishment in the form of removal. But the harms experienced during incarceration persist long after release from the institution, which is what I talk about in my book, Prison Cultures, where I start the job of thinking about desire as a category of imagining or prefiguring what we cannot yet have in the present as part of the experience of being incarcerated. So taking a look at this trajectory in my work, I started to see the links between resisting different paradigms of unfreedom: prisons, state capture, fee-paying schools, dispossessed young people in the Eastern Cape, and colonial universities, and the imperative for what Robin D.G. Kelly calls the pedagogy of dreaming freedom. I invite you to consider that as a connecting point across my examples today. And these images are from my recent work with Paul and colleagues in Cape Town from Imagining Otherwise, which is changing the story. And you'll see some more pictures emerging as I go through. So in another mode, and in the foyer and along the side here as you enter the room, you'll see some examples of practice research resulting in a collaborative installation with my colleague and friend Fenya Kotsokulu, referencing the work of Lombroso and Ferrero, whose 19th century documentation of deviant women set the ground for eugenics, criminalization, and stigma. So what I will share with you today is informed by these different contexts, seemingly quite disparate, but I hope we can find a way of bringing them together in service of a sustained approach to arts and injustice. And to me, this demands attention to place, to what is materially in the present, but also to what is being rehearsed for the future, alongside the strategic retelling of the past, to transform how power is to be stolen back from the center and from hegemonic whiteness. So now on to the present project, to consider the critical spectatorship of justice. Some of the challenges I carry into this work relate to my embodied experience. And it's important as I go through the next phase, which is going to be a monograph, Harm and Repair, that I continue to reflect on the privilege that I hold. A second challenge, which is somewhat related, but I would invite us to continue that conversation as well, is that very often in projects related to arts and peace building, there can be a sense of urgency and a compulsion to report repair. I'll talk about this kind of pace as well as we go through. And that sometimes such work does not account for the messiness and ambiguities that I was referring to earlier. The picture here might be familiar to you from Time magazine cover. It's an image of Johannesburg, known as the world's most unequal country. And this picture exemplifies how very different access to wealth, land, and possession can coexist, sometimes in stark proximity. So I'm going to change my position here so I can see the slides too. So it's important to recognize that a lot of people have characterized current day South Africa as living in the afterlives of injustice. And to me, this doesn't necessarily account for what we can see as a present day inequality, very starkly represented. There can also be, and I'm rushing over some things now because it would take a long time to do justice to the whole history of South African inequality, but there can also be a tendency to valorize the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened in the 90s as ending apartheid peacefully. Okay? Certainly after a transition to democracy, but it was not necessarily an ending in the way that they might have anticipated. And to that end, there's an affect of nostalgia and sometimes melancholy that are predicated on a belief that there was a before that was just, but also that the transition to democracy could or would have been ushering in justice. So because in South Africa the majority have yet to experience this promised freedom, we are currently in the state of almost waiting endlessly for that kind of reparation. So I didn't make this amazing infographic, but what I'm trying to point out here is under the banner of racial capitalism. So a complicated concept, but I'll signal here for you that I'm talking about stolen land enslavement and extractivism. And here you can see the correlation of what the Dutch East India Company, as we know it in English, would be worth if it were judged against present-day multinational companies. And this company was really working in terms of enslaved people and extraction in terms of mining minerals. I've also included this image, which is a snapshot from one of the comics we produced in Imagining Otherwise, which was that Changing the Story project. And this comic, the panels are representing the way that schooling currently, in the present day, replicates and, of course, carries the flavor of injustice from how schooling was set up in 1658 to encourage less well-educated slaves, because as the final pun says there, Hendrik Verwoerd, who was one of our apartheid leaders from the National Party, had said there is no place for the Bantu in the European community above certain levels of slave labor. And that was used to justify policies to keep separate development in place and to keep schooling at a level of inadequacy, which we haven't broken. It still persists. And it's completely devastating when you can see that in action today. So some of the examples I'm referencing now are from mass movements and mobilizations against injustice in South Africa. You can see a few from the past, 60s and 70s, mobilizing against apartheid's past system. And the picture below is from the homeless organization Afar, Lalibas and Londono, who are protesting on the eve of so-called Freedom Day, which marks the moment of democratic elections, the 27th of April, and they march and meet to signal Unfreedom Day because they're still living in this condition of injustice. Okay, I won't do too much more history, but just wanted to signal the artistic practices that had emerged in South Africa's apartheid have become very well codified in terms of protest theatre, so it even became its own genre, which is quite exciting. You may know of or have seen stagings of these works: Woza Albert, Sees Where Bunzi is Dead, The Island, and so on. And in fact, culture was seen as so important to the African National Congress that it was written into the Constitution as one of the foundational rights. And you can see there the quote from Albie Sachs, who was a former Constitutional Court judge, using the phrase, "culture is a weapon," which a lot of artists were very enthusiastic about, because it meant that we had a purpose for sharing the conditions and situation of present suffering and injustice. Okay, and this is the only slide that I'm going to put a whole lot of names up. I'm not going to do a lot more citation, but I wanted to just raise the specter of the names of the people that I think alongside and I work with in my writing. So I'll leave them to look at you for a moment. And I'll introduce now my main driving questions in the monograph project that I'm working on from now, and on my exciting study leave next semester. So harm and repair, I'm thinking about as a mobilization of this problem of injustice that is always understood as past injustice or afterlife, as you saw in that quote, and the idea of repair as a kind of desired outcome, but also as a compulsion, as a necessity, that we have to find repair, which, when you are looking at the arts outcomes, mainstream theatre, for example, it can be quite tiresome, as though we can reach repair and everything will be okay, we'll have forgotten all that injustice and everything will be fine. So it really strongly drawing on that catharsis problem. So really trying to think about how we can address the way that harm and repair is encoded in past struggles. And thinking about reparations and the reparative as to remember that the scale of the harm is codified as racist state violence, and that still continues, organized forgetting, and potential dispossession. Okay, that's probably the most fancy set of words I'm going to say this whole afternoon. But if you think about those things as going alongside racial capitalism, then keep that in mind, then we're good to go. And so it's also part of questioning how we move beyond this idea of the harm and repair in terms of specific events and simply how things are around here. Okay, so that's basically the question of hegemony. Okay, and here we have a kind of methodological invitation from the wonderful Tevye Nyong'o, who uses the subjunctive mood, and he calls it a grammatical mood that is typically used to express various states of unreality, such as desires, emotions, possibilities, etc., or those things that have not yet occurred. So it's the what if kind of question. What if it were to be like this? So that's as part of this understanding of desire for a future that is as yet unknown, as what we mobilize ourselves towards through our actions, through our activism, through our artistic practice. How do we dwell within this subjunctive mood? Okay, and this picture comes from a gathering of Imagining Otherwise and Elise Whelan and Yusolom Schlaver in our project called Power of Word, which I could talk about after. So, in brief, we've got the so-called past harms, in which colonial and apartheid harms persist in the present, and that can be in imperial cultures, naming of buildings, statues, etc. So the university I graduated from, my first few degrees, Rhodes University, still known as Rhodes University. They're not claiming the name. It's almost unconscionable at this point. The ideas of in governance, and so that accounts for the separate development in apartheid, and that was literally spatialized and codified in law, which allowed the state to move people, so forced removals, stolen lands, and dispossessions. And when I say past, it's the recent past. So that was also going on until the late 80s, early 90s. So what this means now in the present, in terms of continuous harms, is that there's a spatialized and racialized inequality that persists in the sense of having unequal access to wealth and opportunities. It also goes alongside this failed dream of the rainbow nation. And I was trying to get a rainbow to put on my front slide as well, but you can just imagine the rainbow right now, which was a very interesting discourse that emerged with the dream of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, this first democratic election, and that, peace and harmony was possible in this very complicated country. Okay? And when people now, so many years later, recognize that, actually this inequality is still persisting, it's very painful, because we have to then recognize that the rainbow nation is maybe not as horrible as we would have wanted, or as hopeful as we would have wanted. There's also this problem right now of state capture, which in brief is a kind of sensation, and this might sound familiar to those of you paying attention in the Clifford Inquiry, where elites dispossess the poor and working class by lining the pockets of friends in big business. Okay, and this is happening right now in South African context in terms of infrastructure, specifically electricity, which is failing sometimes 8, 10, 12 hours a day, even in the big cities. So what I'm arguing for, and I'll show you in some of these examples, is a kind of speculative future that if we can work with this subjunctive collective desire through the Black radical tradition, of dreaming freedom, and with a little bit of anarchism along the way, which allows for destruction as a creative act, that we might find ourselves moving towards repair, which allows us to dwell in this place of the not yet and the role of the arts in resistance. So some of the examples that I'll look at are around toppling or replacing memorials, a degree of accountability for past harms, and resituating memory as regressive. And that means we need to think of the place of the arts in what they call world making. Okay, so that is a kind of imagined potential world of the speculative future. So in this slide, I'm talking here about how I have addressed some of the methodological problems of trying to study this not yet. And one is collaboration with activists who lead from critical hope. And some of that is often quite difficult to keep hold of, critical hope, when you're facing these kind of stark reminders of everything that's going wrong, the violence and the dispossession. It's also important to position the art form within the context of the socio-economic dispossession or organized forgetting, and not to only address the present injustice as a theme of the work, which we might do in something like protest theatre, but to think about the role of the arts in protest itself, in resistance, and in reimagining the world. And what that requires is that we guard against what is easily accessible in the global cultural market, because that can tend to reproduce simplistic narratives of reconciliation and the Rainbow Nation. So that makes it really quite difficult and challenging to study this from abroad. Because what I can see in the UK is those things that already circulate in the global market that do a good job of representing South Africa. Okay, I have written about some of those as well. So how I'm going to address these is through the methodology from Tabia Nyong'o, using fables, which means very brief snapshots on the examples. And I'm using the methodology from Routledge, front row seat, which we adopted and used later in our toolkit as well. And so that site's formulation is really thinking about the place of that struggle, where it's situated, and what that affords that action. So in sites of social reproduction, you'll have to read the toolkit to know more about that, by the way. In sites of social reproduction, I'll use the example of Kondiswa Jays and the ritual of Rhodes Must Fall. I'll also continue to use the example of the same artist at the 2022 State of the Nation address in Parliament. And then I moved to sites of decision, which was a 2021 occupation of the National Arts Council by an opera singer and a grassroots mobilization group, I'm for the Arts. And then finally, I'll refer to a group that I worked with in terms of site destruction, the land back and anti-fracking movement in Ilizwi Lenaniso Lomhlaba, which means the true voice of the land, in a film. So, real quickly to introduce the issue of Rhodes Must Fall. You've likely seen the hashtag, you've likely read all the many newspaper columns on this particular issue. So in brief, in the South African context, because that's also where it is live as an issue, the injustices that are present are around changing higher education circumstances. There's much greater diversity in the student cohort, and there is still the presence of Rhodes and other colonial figures in statutory naming of buildings, etc., which surface the problem of memorialization as a visible harm. There were calls for removals, as you know, and a lot of embodied resistance that occurred. This also happened in Oxford as well. a lot of the time, these were student mobilizations that were asking for institutions to acknowledge and redress their role in post-colonial harms. So here we see the figure of Condiswa James on the plinth that Rhodes' statue was toppled from. I won't have time to share the whole toppling, and I have written about that in the paper, but here you can see the figure of this performance action taking the site of Cecil John Rhodes in the mourning veil, in the black costume, and this kind of spectacular moment in which we might imagine, what if repair were toppling or replacing memorials with such creatures? What if repair were accountability for past harms? And this idea of destruction as a creative act. And there's excellent footage of the performance actions that you can find. And this was a repeated performance gathering momentum over a few years. And some of the imagery references different degrees of harm, boundedness to the past, and to imagined futures. In the second example, from the State of the Nation address, you can see the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who was presenting in front of the Parliament in 2022 about what on earth they were going to do about the 35% unemployment rate and the roughly, a quarter of the population that had signed up for emergency stipends of the equivalent of £17 a month. And when that stipend was cut after COVID, there were riots. Okay, they understood now as the Zuma riots, which is slightly problematic. It was also connected to the former president being arrested. But under these conditions, there was a lot of looting, and let me just go back there, 345 people were killed. So Ramaphosa turns up to speak at the Cape Town City Hall. Parliament building was under repair at that time. And in the sense of referencing his speech, Condiswa James wanted to reference state capture. Okay, complicated idea, but that question of how the state is actually in the pockets of big business, corporations, ultimately still racial capitalism. And her performance, again, in the same kind of clothing, so if you imagine that black dressed figure with the mourning veil, arriving to do an action outside of Parliament, mourning the loss of ideals that have evacuated the ANC leadership post-apartheid. So this is a screenshot from a TV interview because she was arrested and manhandled by police, but I'm going to read what happened during her performance. As she was standing on Darling Street, ahead of the sauna, a man started narrating James's intervention. It was organic and beautiful. He started saying, "We hear you. We're crying. The mother of the city is crying. You're inside having a party." That might also sound familiar. We're thinking about Johnson. "Congratulating yourselves. We're outside crying." He then started chanting, "We want to be free." People joined in the chanting. Then it quietened down and a sister picked it up and started saying, "This is for us. Yes, cry, sister." She started naming all these women who have been murdered. Beg your pardon. Then she and other women started forming a circle around Condiswa James. So a kind of connective moment that got picked up in that performance ritual. And as I'm working on this example, I'm asking the questions, what if repair could be seen in site-specific refusal and resistance? She turned up to make herself present. She wasn't saying anything, the ritual is silent. In this mode of refusal, quiet resistance. She as a black woman, is standing in for the communities most dispossessed by state capture. And that we could see that in the example of the people taking up that ritual. And it's one of the examples of resistant performance that draws attention to the operationalization of race through the control of space. Similarly, in the third example, the occupation of the National Arts Council by Sibongile Mngoma and I'm for the Arts. So I needed to represent her here in her full glory. She's an amazing opera singer, glorious. And in the context of post-COVID, as the chair of this organization, or president, she went to visit the National Arts Council offices, who had awarded this economic stimulus package, a PESP, which was about £15 million altogether, due to COVID. But almost a year later, or perhaps even longer, they hadn't paid it. So people were promised this money and hadn't been paid. And it was really not very much when it turned out to be allocated to the artists. So in their mobilization, they were asking the question, what if repair could be, beg your pardon, holding the state accountable? She entered the National Arts Council offices on, I think it was a day in March, and didn't leave for 60 days. She was joined by other activists and cultural workers, and they took up residence. And in the images that you can see, they made banners, they were singing, they were doing artistic practices together, they collectively mobilized and organized as a means of resisting this dispossession, okay? The grant that was promised to them that hadn't been paid, okay? 60 days. This is the diva that is the president of this mobilization group, sleeping under someone's desk. And here, I had to bring in at least one quote, but this is from Tina Kant, who's talking about the practice of refusal as striving to create possibility in the face of negation. So, entering the space, occupying it, and refusing to leave. Simple as that, but very, very powerful result. Unfortunately, she was also harassed by the police several times. They had a very good tactic of social media visibility and reporting and live streams, etc. But in this picture, you can see how she too, just like Condoleezza James, was manhandled by the police, her clothes were ripped off, humiliating in the streets. Okay, and again here you can see a real stark image of existing. Okay. So in this last example, I'm working with the group that I've worked with in the Karoo, and I'll introduce the whole team in a minute. But just to reference some of the injustices that are faced by these communities. First of all, land stolen from the Khoisan people of the Karoo in the Eastern Cape. Forcible removals to less arable lands, so they couldn't any longer sustain their families on the lands that they were allocated. And under the legislation of apartheid's separate development, it resulted in differential access to resources. The most recent problem being in this area, the promotion of fracking, which would damage the already scarce water supply. So under Changing the Story, and Paul, very nice to have you here, we worked with the Co-Creator Collective, and my principal investigator, comrade and colleague Scott Burnett was the PR, and we wanted initially to work on filmmaking about land injustice. Okay, so we've written about this quite critically in Voicing Ambiguities paper, in which we were reflecting on the process of co-creation, and this was resulting in those over 40 films that were mentioned in the introduction. But also the unwitting imperial codes within the project, including our whiteness as the exemplars of the metropolitan researchers coming in and initiating a project about, what needs to be changed in that region. Part of what we talk about in that paper is the value and the importance of engagement in struggle and research, which can be, and the hour here is Indigenous, so it's important there, a rewriting of Indigenous position in history. And part of what we thought in the first place was producing meaning from the margins, and that's what you were talking about in terms of the voice. However, nonetheless, delivered what we said it would, because we made sure that it did. Okay? And yet, in the example that I'm sharing now, this did not come from the particular project itself. It was an unintended outcome, which I think is what happens when imagination and confidence met the social justice in real life. Because actually when we arrived to do a project about anti-fracking, the young people didn't really care about fracking. Okay? They cared about forcible removals and land injustice, but fracking was not on their agenda. So it's like, oh, what are we going to do now? How do we mobilize nonetheless? And after about, I think this was 18 months after the project, I would recommend watching this very short film. It's lovely. The crew, the co-creator collective, made this entirely speculative piece about a man who is compelled to imagine the future in which the water supply is completely damaged beyond repair, and he has to travel to space to go and find a solution. Okay? And what we see is that this was not all manufactured by us as the metropolitan white elite coming from far away with our ideas about fracking, that it needed the time to percolate. They needed to spend the time after the project to engage with the communities and to really understand what's at stake with fracking. And so there's a few more images from the project that you could see their style. And the film is entirely made by the young people. And the style moves into a kind of, are they on Mars? Are they in another universe? The questions they were asking about repair, I thought, were what if it could be enacted in the form of speculative futures, learning from the destruction of water sources in the imagined future. They really put themselves through this process of imagining what they might need to do. And so in this example, I perceive that repair is in the character of the time traveler and, on the next slide, the non-speaking alien warning of the effects of climate catastrophe. Okay? And, before this, all of the films were very, let's say, polite interviews of community members, well developed, subtitles, translated, etc. And this is entirely different in modality, soundtrack, aesthetics, and everything. So, what does this mean for the critical spectatorship of justice and methodologies? This is where it's important not to have justice and injustice as merely themes in the work, but to recognize how they are informing the conditions that produce the work. They also inform the spectatorial relationships that mobilize outwards from art spaces and into social movements. So for me, it's important to continue critical engagement with both the spectacle or the irresistible images, which we also talk about in the toolkit, #free to download. You can see a QR code outside, and the processes towards social change. And in this paper that I've started sharing some of these ideas, it's a question of the values of redress. So not exactly repair, but mobilizing us towards repair. The question of the not yet, that is a continuous political claim that does not undo the harms by a simplistic or monetary solution. It's like, okay, we'll pay you off, great, have a little stipend, and then next year, work it out for yourselves. That can't work when you've had systematic underdevelopment and dispossession. So ultimately, through all of this, I'm looking for how arts activism needs to contend with the limits and tropes of repair, not just in layman's terms try and crow about the success of how it works or how great it is, but also where does it turn up some knotty and troubling issues. So already mentioned in the intro is the one unintended outcome of Telling a Story project was that we were able to start a library in a school that had never had a library before. So in the Cape Flats, the Library for Social Change, which now exists, and young people can go there and read some books, take out some comics, and play chess if they want to, and imagine otherwise. Moving towards the last few minutes, everyone, so we can get some refreshments. But just to emphasize that all of this goes alongside an ethos of both doing the research and what I hope comes out of the research. Part of what I really believe is that participation in the arts can enable creative modes of resisting injustice. So this, to me, is what connects up all of these disparate places: schools, prisons, community groups, etc. This idea of world-making is a process of creating against epistemic injustice. And one way of seeing that is that arts activism can enable or activate, this phrase from Horizons Thinking, which I only learned the other week, pockets of the future in the present. And to me, all of this signals the importance of collaborative co-creation, because a single researcher shouldn't really be trying to do this by themselves. Okay? And that's because solidarity is the locus of social change. So now an invitation to you. How can you take up arts to resist injustice? And this is, if you can see in the corner, the title there is Impression of a Teen. That's by Torre from Imagining Otherwise. I'm invoking the work here of abolitionist and radical librarian, which is my dream job, and Miriam Kaba, who says that she asked us to imagine what we could imagine for ourselves and for the world, and from there to mobilize. And to that end, I have a new project, and I've got Phoenix and Dalton here, working on arts in abolitionist futures together with the two of you. So that's going to be very exciting to think about how that can work. And all of it needs to imagine and then enact different forms of relating to one another to address harms through accountability. So let us, from our various standpoints and perspectives, seek connecting points between the cultural work that we do, artistic production, and creative activism to develop processes of repair or praxis of repair. And this means we need to grow our understanding of repair beyond a neat understanding of monetary reparations to other forms of what Eve Tuck calls right relationship. And that can be with one another, with the earth, etc. So this invites modes of being together and working towards the anticipated futures, so desire, hope, critical hope, while resisting and refusing unfreedoms in the present. This then means that we work from a basis of relationality and solidarity. What is available to us, and how can arts activism enable sharing or public awareness of the issue that is at stake for you? How can it generate resistance and refusal? And this means there's an ethical commitment, a critical obligation to resist unfreedom. So at this point, it's important to raise full solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians against forgetting. You can find an excellent library of posters from this Palestine poster project, and I would urge you not to be silent. In my last few moments. I'm not going to read the names, but here we see the sweaty assets, hard at work, and you may see your name directly there. Thanks very much to collaborators, to colleagues, to supporters, mentors, and to my family. Thank you very much.